Up and down.
Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. I think of myself coming from the other side of the telescope, as it were. That we've had. I was in furious agreement with what Jason was saying about the planning schemes here, but I want to give the view from the other side of the fence, as it were. I was a recipient of these things and how they work. But just looking at it in terms of the SOE, I was struck by these two, which Eric referred to before, the drop-off in the canopy, which in fact occurred when originally it was caused by the managed investment schemes, which was a tax rod introduced by Howard. When they collapsed, then they stopped having new plantations, and those plantations were almost entirely bought by superannuation schemes. And what we're now trying to do is to put pressure on the superannuation funds by their members to actually use the timber for a higher value use than the wood chips, which I think is a vulnerability. But anyway, this appears to tell a good news story about the amount of canopy that we're losing in relation to the forest. But I was struck by this, which looking at the other types of ecosystems that we have in the state, which are being progressively decimated. And the point that the SOE makes about it is that it's because of urban development. So back to Jason's point that we should have included the townscapes in all of this, because that's where these very vulnerable areas, the grasslands, the wetlands, the button grass plains, those sort of things are, and that's what's not being measured at the moment. So it's the good news, bad news story. I think we really need to refocus on the expansion of urban development. So, hence my argument that we need to look at the planning scheme. Now, I think the planning scheme is, I've worked in every state and territory in Australia, either as a consultant or developer doing schemes, and I have to say Tasmania is by far the weakest planning scheme I have ever encountered. Hence the Lang Walkers, the bottom feeders, coming down here to prey on us. I'm much ashamed to say that my uncle's company, Lewis Land, developed about half of the canal blocks on the Gold Coast against my screaming protest, but they have stopped now. And as I asked Jason, that was because of the introduction of legislation in Queensland for coastal protection. They basically just can't do it anymore, so they've just stopped and they've gone on to other things. So that is the good news. You can do something to stop it, essentially. Now, this I'm going to characterise the Tasmanian planning scheme. You might have heard of the scheme. I put up Tempest, which was a retirement village up at Swansea, which I spent a couple of years putting through the process. The council loved it. There was a lot of community support, but it was knocked off in the Planning Commission, even though, because of a clause of one of the planning instruments, the Southern Region Land Use Strategy, even though we had the author of that come in and testify on our behalf, saying if she'd known about our proposal, she would have included it in the Strellis. What the Planning Commission said, well, okay, go and change the Strellis, which initially I thought, oh great, we'll be able to do this. My planner had his head in his hands, shaking his head, because he realised that they have to do a structure plan for every town in southern Tasmania in order to change that. So they're about, he said it'd be 4 or 5 years. That was 4 years ago, and they're only about halfway through doing it. So I've given up on that process. But these are the kinds of things that we were asked to do by that planning scheme. And they all seem reasonable. Of course, you would check these sort of things, visual impact and the height controls and so on. But notice that all of these relate to human factors. These are about people complaining. This is really not looking at the big picture at all, and it's rule-based. It's you will do this, you can't do more than that, you've got to go stop here. Not what is the objective. Now, I'm more familiar with the other schemes, particularly in Queensland and New South Wales, and they are much more driven as performance criteria. They basically say what it is you're trying to achieve. Now, how are you going to satisfy that requirement? And that is a much better way, a healthier way to go than this very mechanical way of doing things. This is just some of the things that I came across which I'm used to doing, which weren't in evidence here. There are virtually no density controls here at all. I've been doing schemes in the Tasman, the Sorell and the Glamorgan Spring Bay areas in the East Coast. None of these have any constraints on how many places you can build, and that has the biggest implication on what the infrastructure impact is of these things. So if you're going to get an idea of appropriate scale development, you have to start with density controls, I think. The riparian zones, I was absolutely astonished to find that they are not required. You can develop in a riparian zone. In New South Wales, one of the things that's absolutely sacrosanct, and in Queensland, even my uncle would say, oh, you can't go anywhere near a creek. There's usually 20 metres either side is a no-go zone. You just can't do anything within those. Here, I did a commission to do a development down at Cape Rowell, and the client said, oh, I want to have this building sitting over a waterfall that's in a creek going down. I said, no, you can't go anywhere near that. You're going to be 20 metres. Oh, no. We went in and asked the planner in the council, and they said, oh, yes, you're not going to knock down too many trees, are you? I was just flabbergasted. And I'll show you that example. Things like stormwater discharge. I'll show you a good example of how the code here sort of says you'll have a pipe this big, it has to go here, and it ends up being a very complicated and expensive process to go through. I'll show you one example that was brought about by an activist group to do with a scheme on the East Coast, which had a much better solution to that. You're looking at trees as well, that in Sydney, every single tree, every council would know every single tree, its significance and where it is. And if you touched it, then there are jowl terms attached to chopping trees down. Here, I go along to ask the council which are the significant trees. We don't know. My neighbour at the moment's been developing the site, and they just put a bulldozer through every tree on the site, and there was nothing you could do about it, even though there was quite significant trees in those terms. So there's no data. Well, I was pleased to hear what Jason was saying, that there is the possibility of data. You can get it, but the councils apparently don't use it or don't have access to it. And the requirement for trees, usually councils have a policy, it's usually at the council level, that you will plant 2 trees with every house. I haven't come across any requirement for that sort of thing here. There's also a problem with we have the 6-star algorithm used to run houses through, but it's an incredibly crude one down here, I find, and it's not one you're allowed to use. In Sydney I would do it myself so that I could balance the factors between each other, but here it's neatly tied up. You have to go and do a certificate course and then you can come back. It's not a difficult thing to do, but so I have somebody else making choices between whether they have a rainwater tank or whether they have solar panels or double glazing or whatever it is, and they just present me with a fait accompli, which is really silly. But one of the things is the algorithm down here doesn't take into account trees. So in Sydney, I could say I'm going to plant 2 trees here, or there's an existing tree here which is providing shade, so I don't need to put a veranda there. Or conversely, that the trees are here, so they're going to take the solar gain that you could expect. It really is an essential part of the modelling of the real world to realise that you have to include those. But this is such a crude algorithm, it doesn't include those things. Waste management, I was just asked to say where are we going to put the bins basically, but you really need a thoroughgoing waste management strategy, particularly for larger developments. Silt runoff, I'll show you a bad example of that. Minimising light pollution, water management plans, critical, but really they just want to know where you're going to run the stormwater pipe. They don't really say that it needs to be a fully integrated thing. There is no excuse for not doing stormwater harvesting and using that for irrigation on a site, particularly on any scale of development, and that would be expected on the mainland. Soil orientation, material choice, soil contamination. A lot said here about the time that it takes to get approvals. I don't have a problem with that. As Ray Heffernan, who was my mentor, used to say, there's no point in being quick and wrong. You need to do the homework, and there's no really quick answers to it. However, I do have a problem with what it costs, because they basically go into absurd levels of detail about things which they don't make clear what the objective is. So in the case of that Tempest development, cost us about $500,000 to do that, and about 200,000 or 300,000 of that was consultancies to work out every detail of of where the stormwater pipes were going, where the power came in. You don't need to know that. No developer's going to build a development which can't access the services because he won't be able to sell it. That's an issue for the building certificate to work out at a later stage once you've got the approval. But they expect you to take the risk of the investment you need to make before they've made a decision about whether they'll allow you to do it or not. So the costs involved in that are, I mean, that $500,000 really has prevented me from going on to other developments because it's basically taken away my room to move. Sorry, I think I've... This is just looking at some of those factors. The riparian impact out of the Statement of the Environment report shows impact on various areas, riparian areas in different cases, which can be as high as 80% and has an average of about 40%. So this is really significant. The only constraint that I've come across is in forestry agreements that they have to behave in certain ways, or are supposed to behave in certain ways around creek lines. But in the planning terms, when you're doing buildings, there's no requirement at all. And that really is essential because we've heard all day what the importance of these things. They are the spines that connect the ecosystems together. They're the fauna corridors. They're the places which where the last vestige where the animals go to drink and so on. In fact, I've heard a very plausible argument, which I think needs further investigations, that councils should be redefined not in terms of where the towns are, but actually in terms of where the catchments are. If you do the catchments and draw the lines around what Christine was showing before, if we define the councils in Tasmania around where the catchments were, it ties in beautifully because they're also the sight lines. So you have view corridors, it's where the roads tend to go. It makes more sense to me than actually clustering it where the towns historically have happened to be. I think in terms of a Labor policy, we should look at that. We should look at that more thoroughly. This was the one I was talking about after my uncle got turned off doing the canal developments. He did this one in next to Port Macquarie in New South Wales, and because it's New South Wales, he realised that the planning constraints didn't allow him to get away with the murder that he used to be able to do, and I have to say a level of corruption as well. He actually gave me control of this to get the approval, and we did this as a community for 11,000 people, and it was koala habitat, quite sensitive koala habitat, so we preserved all of the riparian corridors running through this, which provided fauna links between the various breeding populations. We orientated the lots so that everyone could get north-facing exposure. We introduced a policy which was a voluntary thing on our part about no cats and dogs in there because of the koalas, and there was just no way of managing that without it. I'm a great dog lover, but I couldn't live there because it wouldn't work in that environment. But the thing sold quite well. People accepted that as a constraint, and we did a very thoroughgoing water management strategy, which meant that no water was needed to irrigate any of the landscape. So the drinking water, the council water that came in was just for drinking. It wasn't for anything else. And we won a national award for that from the Urban Design Council, but my uncle also made a fortune out of it, so it just shows you can do both. And in fact, he's died now, but he actually came back to me for each of their developments after that because he could see it actually works and it's actually a saleable thing. You're not talking about a contradiction, as Vanessa was saying. It is not either or. You actually value add when you create a decent environment. Leaving the trees there enabled them to sell the blocks more easily than just doing what you usually did and flatten the site before they did anything. This was the one down at Cape Rail I was talking about where the client wanted me to go into the bush, and this was the building. Because they insisted that we do it and the council allowed it, I had to create a building, but it did minimise the impact by putting very slender footings down that didn't have much impact on it, and took all of the wastewater back to the other part of the development and had only access from the outside of this, so that to minimise all of those impacts. We ended up only having to chop down 2 trees that were significant, which they were pleased about. And I don't think they'll venture down into here because, as we discovered, this is alive with tiger snakes, so they won't wander down into that too readily. The waste management is another thing. The State of the Environment report identifies that about 2/3 of the waste that's produced, it comes from building or domestic uses. So it's really got to be tackled at the building level. That's really where waste is coming from. This was the retirement village I did near New South Wales, near Sydney, which where I cut my teeth on doing these, doing a proper going water management plan, waste management plan. And what I discovered in this exercise, while we had a lot of successes with this, is that it's that I needed more space to allocate for those various things. So I've designed that in now in different ways. But one of the lessons out of this, designed it as it's very environmental, very modern, and ran into strong resistance from the agents and from Macquarie Bank, who are the backers for this. No, it's got to be, old people want traditional houses and this. No, they don't. And we proved the point with this. And the thing that I said to them was that the baby boomers are ageing hippies, because I am one. So they are very sensitive to that. And this proved to be correct too. It's sold like hotcakes, and in fact, sold as quickly as we built it. And in fact, it has doubled in value in its first 5 years since that was completed. People want that sort of thing, contrary to what the market believes. And that's the village as completed. It's every unit faces north. We have cross ventilation through each of the units. You have areas that you can only get into through one of the units, which become shared space. It's worked in a lot of ways, and I've learned a lot of lessons out of doing this. When the Tempest was knocked back by the Planning Commission, the council was quite upset and came to me. The mayor and the general manager came and said, "Look, we want the development to happen. Will you consider other sites that we could move it onto?" And we've actually investigated 5 sites, and this was one of them, the Solace development, which was approved 20 years ago under a specific area plan, which basically is a cheat device. If you don't like what the planning scheme says, then you just go and say, "Oh, yes, well, but all those rules, except in this case, we'll let you do that," which it just shouldn't. When I did Tempest, we did a proper rezoning, so it's rewriting the planning scheme for that part of it. But this was a SAP 20 years ago to do a golf course and 600 lots, and it's never happened because it was never feasible to start with. But it shows what can go wrong with this process. This was what I mentioned before when talking about the silt runoff that you get in developments and the stormwater. How the stormwater should be managed. When the SAP was being written, there were some local activists who were retired academics who were very active in having that scheme changed, and they got them to write in a clause that says you will not discharge any stormwater from here into Prosser Bay which isn't at the same quality that it currently goes in. Now there's a good performance criteria. It's not telling you how to do it, it's just saying you have to prove that you're not creating any more pollution than currently exists. So when they started, then they tried to do the first part of this. The people who wrote that in objected and won on the basis that they weren't, they were just putting stormwater pipes down here and running it into the bay. They then turned it around to create a dam here because they realised that they didn't have any water to irrigate the golf course with. The dam didn't work, and it turned into a silt slurry that came out in this bay, and this, which was a quite pristine beach, now can't be walked on because it's got about 2 feet of sludge across that because of that dam that they put in that they didn't manage. So I went to the council, I said, "Why aren't you taking action against these developers?" They said, "We haven't got any grounds to do it. There is no provision that would stop them from doing that. It's in any other jurisdiction I've come across, then you'd be prosecuted instantly for doing that, but doesn't seem to be any provision to allow for that." This was the alternative scheme which I put up to them, which is completely self-contained in terms of its water management. Got rid of the golf course, turned that into open space, and had different types of housing. There is no lot housing in this at all. And I've spent the last 3 years trying to convince the people who own that, who are in Melbourne, to let me develop it on their behalf. And the father won't let me, and the sons will, so I'm waiting for the father to get out of the way at the moment. I won't go into this because I think I'm running out of time.
John, are you happy to sort of pull it up there and we'll jump into the rest of the discussion?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
I think the other go over. Eric, Jason, hang on here, just-
Could I just make one more point? I'm just sort of flicking through my notes on this, which I thought was very germane. When we went to the Planning Commission with Tempest, my lawyer was going down the street. She had one of those trolleys that you have that was stacked full of the files, which was our submission on this thing. Cambria Green, which was an alternative scheme which was done north of Swansea, a Chinese proposal. She said I carried it in a ring binder. I went in, and there's a 3,000 hectare scheme. But the planner who was doing that, Irene Duckett, told me when I approached her initially about that, oh yes, you use the mushroom strategy, keep them in the dark and feed them bullshit. Don't tell them anything, which was the antithesis of what the approach that I like to take. So that's another fundamental thing that the planning scheme as it is now is inducing. Sorry.
Eric, Jason, are you happy to stand or sit at the front?
We have some seats up the front, so
Yeah, that's fine. Good work.
Should we just put them in front? Yeah. And I might put you reasonably close together so we can have that mic and put it on the central person. Thank you.
Okay, so what we thought we'd do is we'd get Jason, Eric and John to bounce some ideas around and debate the various